I used to think the fire in the backyard was the cruelest thing my parents could do. I was wrong. Watching my college applications turn to ash was just the loud part. The real theft happened long before the flames, buried in quiet bank transfers and 18 years of choosing my older brother over my future. It took 6 months and one phone call from my grandmother's lawyer to finally understand how deep their betrayal went. My name is Amelia Winslow. I am 18 years old, and I have spent my entire life in Cedar Hollow, Ohio, learning how to be the dependable ghost in a house that worships chaos. In our home, stability was a given, an invisible foundation that was completely ignored until someone needed to stand on it. Every ounce of attention, every spare dollar, and every shred of parental grace was reserved for the loudest noise in the room. And in the Winslow family, that noise was always my older brother, Grant. While Grant spent his teenage years leaving a spectacular trail of half-finished projects, wrecked cars, and unkept promises, I was quietly building a paper fortress. I understood early on that nobody was coming to save me, so I had to construct my own way out. I earned top grades in every single class, maintaining a flawless academic record through sheer, exhausting force of will. I scored a near perfect on my SATs, missing only 20 points on the entire exam after studying for hundreds of hours at the kitchen table long after the rest of the house had gone to sleep. I collected glowing letters of recommendation from teachers who recognized the quiet, desperate hunger behind my polite demeanor. But my true escape, the thing that kept my spirit alive, was my architecture portfolio. Cedar Hollow was a dying Rust Belt town, a place defined by crumbling brick facades, abandoned textile mills, and sagging Victorian wraparound porches. It was a town slowly forgetting its own history. I spent countless afternoons walking those decaying streets, filling sketchbooks with charcoal and ink. I drew the old buildings not as they were, but as they could be. I redesigned broken public squares, drafted structural supports for caving roofs, and reimagined the neglected spaces of my hometown. I wanted to understand how things stayed upright when the world pushed down on them. I was trying to learn how to be structurally sound, because God knew my family was not. My father, Russell Winslow, certainly had no concept of a solid foundation. He ran a struggling small contracting firm called Redstone Restoration Group. He printed the name on glossy business cards and slapped it on the side of a rusted work truck, speaking of the business as if it were a sprawling corporate empire. The reality was a ledger constantly bleeding red ink and a desperate scramble to make payroll every 2 weeks. Despite this grim reality, my father constantly insisted that Grant was the natural heir to the throne. It completely escaped his notice that Grant was chronically unreliable, dangerously impulsive, and entirely allergic to manual labor. Grant was always chasing his next big idea. In our house, next big idea was a coded phrase for a new, creative way to lose thousands of dollars. My mother, Diane Winslow, was the architect of this delusion. She never openly screamed at me. She never threw plates or slammed doors in a rage. If she had, it might have been easier to fight back. Instead, she weaponized a chilling domestic coldness. She used calm dismissal. She used strategic silence. If I brought home an award for a state-level design competition, she would offer a tight, close-lipped smile, say it was nice, and immediately ask if I could help Grant format the flyers for his newest doomed venture. The steady, undeniable message drumming through my entire childhood was that my achievements were fundamentally worthless unless they could be harvested, repurposed, and used to serve my brother. I was the scaffolding. Grant was the monument. I knew this dynamic intimately. I had lived it for 18 years. Yet, hope is a remarkably stubborn and pathetic thing. It survives in the dark, even when it has absolutely no logical reason to exist. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday evening in early November. The kitchen smelled heavily of overcooked pot roast and damp wool coats. I sat at the dinner table, my hands trembling slightly under the laminated wood of the tabletop. Tucked inside my notebook, resting against my thigh, were 3 letters. They were early responses from university admissions offices, and they were overwhelmingly positive. The letters hinted at acceptance into premier architecture programs, and more importantly, explicitly stated that I would qualify for major merit-based scholarships. This was the lifeline. This was the golden ticket out of Cedar Hollow. I waited for a lull in the conversation. I waited until my father had finished a long, bitter complaint about the rising cost of commercial lumber. I took a deep, shaky breath, pulled the letters from my notebook, and cautiously shared the news. I kept my voice low and even. I told them about the schools. I mentioned the phrase, full tuition potential. I looked back and forth between my parents, waiting for a spark of pride, a word of congratulations, or even just a flicker of relief that my education would not be a financial burden on the family. Instead, my father paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. He looked at me, then looked across the table at my mother, and then he laughed. It was not a cruel, villainous laugh. That would have required him to see me as a threat. It was a dismissive, mildly amused chuckle, as if I had just earnestly suggested we buy a private jet. "Amelia," my father said, shaking his head and pointing his fork at me. "That is a nice thought, really, but we are not doing that. The family's money is not going to be wasted on somebody who already knows how to survive." The words dropped onto the dinner table like heavy stones. I stared at him, my throat suddenly dry. The air knocked completely out of my lungs. Wasted. He called investing in my future a waste. "Wasted," I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. "Dad, it is an investment. I have the grades. I have the portfolio. The scholarships would cover almost everything. I just need a little help with the housing deposits and the application fees." "And Grant has a vision," my father interrupted, his tone instantly hardening into that familiar, immovable wall of blind faith. He wiped his mouth forcefully and tossed his paper napkin onto his plate. "Every available dollar we have needs to stay right here in the family. Grant is preparing a massive business expansion plan for Redstone Restoration Group. We are buying new equipment. We are expanding the service area. It is going to put us on the map, and we need all our capital concentrated on that launch." I felt the blood drain entirely from my face, leaving my skin cold and prickling. "An expansion plan. Dad, are you serious?" His last 3 plans were disasters. The power washing initiative ended in a lawsuit. The custom furniture flipping left our garage full of rotting wood. He loses money every single time. "That is quite enough, Amelia," my mother interjected. Her voice was perfectly level, perfectly chilled, and terrifyingly calm. She did not even look at me. She kept her eyes fixed intently on the salt shaker in the center of the table. "Your brother is trying to build a legacy for all of us. He takes risks. You cannot punish him for having ambition. We need you here. We need you working locally. You can get a job in town, help out with the company books, and keep things steady at home. You are the smart one. You are the dependable one. You can manage just fine without some fancy degree." I sat perfectly still, the ambient sounds of the kitchen fading into a high-pitched, ringing static in my ears. I looked at my father, who was puffing his chest out with misplaced, aggressive pride over a son who used him like an ATM. I looked at my mother, cutting her meat with surgical precision, completely undisturbed by the fact that she had just casually, effortlessly severed my future. And in that one humiliating, devastating moment, the truth crystallized in my mind with absolute, blinding clarity. They had never intended to discuss my future in good faith. It did not matter how hard I worked. There was no rational argument I could make, no architectural portfolio impressive enough, no standardized test score high enough to change their minds. They had already decided my fate years ago. I was the designated anchor meant to keep the Winslow family from sinking. I was the workhorse meant to pull Grant's dead weight for the rest of my natural life. My competence was not a ticket to freedom. It was the very reason they intended to keep me chained to them. The emotional wound of that scene was profound, but it did not make me cry. It did not make me scream, or throw my plate against the wall, or demand justice. Instead, it felt like a clean surgical fracture deep inside my chest. The naive, childlike part of me that desperately wanted their approval, the part that still believed in merit and fairness, simply snapped and died right there at the dinner table. I looked down at the letters resting in my lap. I slowly slid them back into my notebook and closed the cover. I picked up my fork and took a bite of cold, tasteless food. I did not argue. I did not defend my dreams. I just nodded my head. From that evening onward, everything changed. I stopped expecting anything resembling fairness from my parents. I realized that if I was going to survive, if I was going to build a life that belonged to me and not to Grant's endless failures, I could no longer fight them in the open light of day. I had to become exactly what they thought. I was: silent, compliant, and invisible. The fracture was complete. I stopped begging for my future, and I started moving in absolute silence. The house in Cedar Hollow transformed from a suffocating trap into a hostile landscape that I had to navigate with military precision. I realized that survival was no longer about keeping the peace. It was about controlling the flow of information. I became an architect of my own disappearance, drafting a life completely hidden behind closed doors and fake smiles. My first act of rebellion was entirely digital. During a free period on a rainy Wednesday afternoon, I sat at a computer in the furthest, most shadowy corner of the high school media center and created a private email account. I used a randomized string of words that my family could never guess, a digital burner phone for my ambitions. From that day forward, between the hours of 3 o'clock and 5 o'clock, while my mother thought I was organizing the library archives for extra credit, I was launching my escape. The application process was a grueling secondary full-time job. It required a level of secrecy that frayed my nerves down to the wire. My nights were fractured into shifts. I would go to bed at 10 o'clock, listen to the floorboards groan as my brother stumbled in around midnight, and wait for the deep, rhythmic snoring from my parents' bedroom down the hall. At 2 in the morning, I would slip out from under my covers. The glow of my laptop screen felt as bright as a searchlight in the pitch-black room. I typed essays with the screen brightness turned down to a sliver, the silence of the house pressing against my eardrums. I was exhausted, existing on 4 or 5 hours of sleep a night, but the fatigue was a pure adrenaline-laced fuel. It was the physical sensation of moving forward. I could not do it entirely alone, though I tried. The logistics of college applications required adult intervention, and I found my conspirators in the brightly lit, linoleum-floored corridors of my high school. My guidance counselor, Mrs. Leona Barrett, was a sharp-eyed woman who kept a steady supply of mints and brutal honesty in her cramped office. When I sat down across from her and handed over a printed list of my target schools, she did not give me the patronizing smile I was used to receiving from adults in Cedar Hollow. She looked at my academic record, looked at the list, and simply asked how we were going to bypass my parents' financial blockade. She gave me application fee waivers with a quiet nod, slipping them into blank envelopes so they looked like standard administrative forms. My English teacher, Mr. Owen Pike, became the architect of my personal statements. I spent dozens of lunch periods sitting at a desk in the back of his empty classroom, watching his red pen slash through my polite, restrained prose. He forced me to write about the structural integrity of old buildings as a metaphor for resilience without making it sound like a plea for pity. He and Mrs. Barrett were the first adults in years to treat my dreams as concrete, tangible destinations rather than the childish fantasies of a girl who needed to accept her proper place. They looked at me and saw someone worth building up, not someone to be broken down for spare parts, armed with their support. I targeted programs that felt like entirely different universes. I applied to the Briar Glen School of Architecture, a fiercely competitive institution hundreds of miles away that offered a direct path to licensure. I submitted packets to the Midlands State Honors College, seeking their rigorous design cohorts. I also threw my hat into the ring for a prestigious summer bridge fellowship tied specifically to urban design and renewal. I wanted to learn how to tear down rot and build something enduring. But the glamorous parts of the applications, the essays, and the portfolio designs were nothing compared to the suffocating weight of the bureaucracy. I had to become a thief in my own home. To complete the required scholarship verification paperwork and financial aid formulas, I needed access to my family's tax forms. One weekend, when my parents took my brother out to celebrate a minor and entirely fabricated milestone in his business plan, I picked the cheap lock on my father's home office filing cabinet. My hands shook violently as I photographed 3 years of federal returns, W-2 statements, and property tax records. I printed everything out at a local copy shop, paying $25 in loose change that I had scavenged from the laundry room over several months. I compiled these mind-numbingly boring documents into a thick, heavy binder. It was an incredibly dull collection of paper, but to me, it was the most thrilling thing I had ever touched. It represented my only path out. As the physical evidence of my escape grew, so did the need to ground myself. I needed advice from someone who understood exactly what I was up against, quietly, and from a payphone outside the local pharmacy to avoid itemized phone bills. I dialed my grandmother, Evelyn Winslow. Evelyn had long been treated as a hostile outsider by my parents. Her crime was simple and unforgivable in their eyes 5 years ago. She had firmly and permanently closed her checkbook, refusing to rescue my brother from the financial wreckage of his first major scheme. When Evelyn answered the phone, her voice was crisp and devoid of the saccharine warmth that usually masks family dysfunction. I poured out my secret, my voice barely above a whisper, expecting her to warn me about the risks. Instead, she asked practical, surgical questions. She asked where the physical documents were hidden. She asked if my new email was secure. She did not make grand promises to sweep in and save me. She offered something much better strategy. Do not leave a single original document where they can reach it, Evelyn warned me, the line crackling slightly over the distance. Keep copies. Hide them in places they would never lower themselves to look. I asked her if I was doing the right thing, if I was abandoning my duty to the family. I will never forget the sudden, fierce steel in her tone when she replied, Amelia, listen to me carefully. The people who fear your future will always call it selfish. Let them. You build your house anyway. Her words became the mortar holding my nerves together as the winter thawed into spring and the responses began to arrive. The first acceptance email hit my secret inbox on a Tuesday morning. The second arrived a week later. Along with the acceptances came invitations for intensive scholarship interviews, which I conducted via video call in the school library utility closet during my lunch breaks. Then came the message that stopped my heart completely. It was from Briar Glen's School of Architecture. It was not just an acceptance, it was an offer for a deferred, full tuition financial package. It covered everything: classes, housing, and material fees for 4 complete years. The sheer magnitude of the offer made me dizzy. It was a golden key, but there was a massive, terrifying condition attached to it. The package was deferred pending one final, physical submission of my verified financial portfolio and my original signature on their acceptance contract by the end of the month. I printed the Briar Glen package on heavy cardstock at the copy shop. I placed it inside my hidden binder, along with my meticulously crafted portfolio boards and the signed recommendation letters. I hid the entire thick, rigid package deep inside the false bottom of my closet, buried beneath winter sweaters I never wore. I did not breathe a single word to my family. I sat at the dinner table night after night, listening to my father praise my brother's phantom expansions, and I chewed my food in perfect, obedient silence. For the first time in my 18 years of life, I owned something completely. I was protecting a future that belonged entirely to me. I felt powerful. I felt invincible. But I had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the house I was living in. I did not realize that the very secrecy I was using to protect my dreams was turning them into a target. By building my life behind closed doors, I ensured that when they finally forced the locks, their retaliation would not just be an argument, it would be an execution. The betrayal began with a digital footprint. I was sitting in my final period history class, completely unaware that the fragile architecture of my future was being dismantled. Grant had been frantically scouring the home office for financial records. He needed proof of revenue to secure a desperately sought commercial loan for a venture that was already failing. When the physical filing cabinet yielded nothing, he dug into the desktop computer. He opened the printer spool history. There, wedged between his own overdue invoices, he found the cash titles of my printed documents: Briar Glen acceptance contract, housing deposit waiver, financial aid verification form. He did not confront me. He went directly to the one person who could stop me. My mother did not ransack my bedroom like a common thief. She executed a clinical excavation. While I was taking notes on the Industrial Revolution, she was systematically tearing through my sanctuary. She found the false bottom in my closet. She extracted the heavy, meticulously organized scholarship binder. She pulled out the thick envelopes containing my official acceptance packets and the oversized, rigid portfolio boards I was supposed to carry onto a train in exactly 48 hours for my final interview weekend. When I walked up our driveway at 4 o'clock that afternoon, the house felt unnervingly hollow. Then, the smell hit me. It was not the comforting, earthy scent of neighborhood brush fires. It was a sharp, chemical sting. It smelled like melting plastic binding, scorched heavyweight cardstock, and evaporating printer ink. A cold dread, heavy and absolute, dropped into my stomach. I threw my backpack onto the porch and sprinted toward the backyard. My parents were standing by the rusted iron fire pit at the edge of the lawn. The autumn air was crisp, but the heat radiating from the pit warped the space between us. My father held a long iron poker, casually stirring a thick bed of glowing orange embers. My mother stood beside him, her posture perfectly straight, holding my thick black scholarship binder against her chest like a shield. I froze. The scene was cinematic in its cruelty, yet suffocatingly grounded in practical, irreversible damage. This was not just a symbolic rejection. I watched, paralyzed, as my father used the poker to push a heavy piece of foam board deeper into the flames. I recognized the charcoal lines instantly. It was my redesign of the Cedar Hollow public square. It represented hundreds of hours of drafting, erasing, and perfecting. The edges blistered, turned a sickening yellow, and then burst into bright, consuming fire. Beside the pit, an empty cardboard box held the rest of my life. I saw the original, wet ink signatures of Mr. Pike and Mrs. Barrett on my recommendation letters curling into black ash. I saw the notarized financial aid verification paperwork, the exact documents required to secure my deferred full tuition, melting into the coals. My mailed admissions packets, the tangible proof that I was worth something to the outside world, were being methodically fed into the blaze one stack at a time. "What are you doing?" I asked. My voice was completely hollow. It did not sound like my own. My mother turned to me. Her face was a mask of serene, terrifying conviction. She did not look angry. She looked like a parent gently correcting a toddler who had wandered too close to the street. "We are fixing a mistake, Amelia," she said, her voice so smooth and calm it sent a violent shiver down my spine. She tossed a thick stack of scholarship instructions into the fire. The paper flared instantly, illuminating her impassive features. "You have been incredibly deceitful, sneaking around, plotting to abandon your responsibilities. Leaving now would completely tear this family apart. Grant is at a critical juncture with his business expansion. We need everyone pulling their weight, not indulging in another one of your expensive phases." "Expensive," I choked out, taking a mechanical step closer to the blistering heat. "It is a full ride. It covers everything. The tuition, the housing, the materials. I would not cost you a single penny. You just have to let me go." My father stopped stirring the ashes. He leaned heavily on the iron poker and looked at me with a mixture of exhaustion and profound irritation. He did not look like a man destroying his daughter's life. He looked like a man annoyed by a lingering headache at the end of a long shift. "Nothing is ever truly free, Amelia," he grunted, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "There are hidden fees, travel costs, living expenses, but that is entirely beside the point. Even if it were 100% free, We cannot afford to lose your income from a local job. We need that money in the household." "It is my future," I whispered, the reality of the destruction finally pressing down on my chest with the weight of concrete. "You are burning my only way out," my father scoffed, a short, ugly sound that cut through the crackle of the flames. "Do not act like you are destitute. You have had plenty of financial support." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the sheer absurdity of the statement. What financial support? I buy my own clothes from thrift stores. I paid for my own standardized tests with loose change. You have never given me a single dollar for school. My father looked away, his jaw tightening. For a fraction of a second, something resembling shame flickered across his rugged face, but it was quickly swallowed by his towering pride. "Your grandmother Evelyn set up an education account for you years ago," he muttered, his eyes fixed firmly on the burning portfolio boards. "A substantial one. It was supposed to be for college." The world seemed to tilt violently on its axis. "Evelyn gave you money for me? Where is it?" "It was used where it was needed," my mother interjected sharply, stepping closer to my father to present a united, impenetrable front. The family was in a severe financial crisis. Grant had a major setback with his commercial equipment lease 3 years ago. If we had not covered his debts, he would have faced serious legal trouble. "You were just a child, Amelia. You did not need the money then." "Your brother did." The breath left my lungs in a ragged, painful exhale. The fire in the backyard was not the original betrayal. It was merely the visible one. The real theft had happened quietly, behind my back, while I was sitting at the kitchen table studying until my eyes blurred. My college fund was gone. They had liquidated my future to subsidize Grant's failures long before I ever filled out an application, and now they were burning the evidence that I could succeed without their money. The back door creaked open. Grant stepped out onto the porch, holding a half-empty bottle of soda. He looked at the fire, then at me, and let out a long, theatrical sigh. "Come on, Amelia. Do not be so dramatic," he muttered. Leaning lazily against the wooden railing, he looked entirely unbothered by the fact that his survival was being purchased with my destruction. "It is just paper. You can always attend the community college over in the next county later if you really want to read so badly. We need you here right now. Stop making this all about you." He had internalized the family hierarchy so completely that he truly believed my life was a secondary resource meant to be tapped whenever he ran dry. He was not even being malicious. He was just stating the fundamental law of our household. At that exact moment, a profound and terrifying silence settled over my mind. The frantic, terrified girl who had been shaking in her shoes died right there on the manicured lawn. The panic evaporated. Something inside my chest hardened into absolute, impenetrable granite. I looked at the three of them, my mother with her chilling calm, my father with his justified theft, and my brother with his boundless entitlement. I did not fall to my knees in the grass. I did not scream until my throat bled. I did not beg them to stop throwing the papers into the fire, because I finally understood that they wanted a reaction. They needed me to break, so they could comfortably mold me back into the shape they required. I turned my back on the fire pit and walked into the house. I did not say a single word in my defense. I waited until the house was completely dark, and the only sound was the low hum of the kitchen refrigerator. At 2 o'clock in the morning, I pulled a dark canvas duffel bag from beneath my bed. I did not pack memories or sentimental trinkets. I packed pure survival. 3 pairs of jeans, a handful of plain shirts, and my heaviest winter coat. I reached deep under my mattress and retrieved a small, encrypted flash drive. It contained the digital backups of my architectural portfolio, my essays, and my scanned verification forms. They had burned the paper, but they did not know enough about me or my methods to burn the digital cloud. I took the $85 I had hidden inside the battery compartment of an old desk radio. I slung the heavy bag over my shoulder. I walked silently down the hallway, gliding past the closed bedroom doors where my family slept soundly, comfortable in their absolute belief that they had finally broken me into submission. I opened the front door, stepped into the freezing night air, and left no note behind. I made my way toward the bus station, reclaiming my life with my own bruised hands, without making a single promise that I would ever return. Riverton, Ohio, was only a bus ride of 3 hours away from the stifling borders of Cedar Hollow, but the moment I stepped onto the cracked concrete of the transit center, it felt like I had landed on an entirely different planet. It was a mid-sized city, a sprawling grid of gray overpasses, dense neighborhoods, and relentless traffic. No one here knew my face. No one here knew my family. For the first time in my life, I was entirely anonymous, and that anonymity was both terrifying and incredibly liberating. My first month was a brutal masterclass in transient survival. I rotated through living spaces with the desperate momentum of a fugitive. I spent my first 7 nights in an extended-stay motel situated right off the interstate. The room smelled permanently of stale tobacco and cheap bleach, and the neon vacancy sign buzzed outside my window all night, casting a harsh red glare over the thin blankets. When the cash from my hidden radio stash dwindled down to a dangerous $20, I answered a listing on a community board and moved into a cheap sublet. My space consisted of a bare mattress shoved into the corner of a drafty living room, shared with 3 college students who never washed their dishes. When the primary tenant was suddenly evicted, I spent a week sleeping on a sagging, floral-patterned couch borrowed from a girl I had spoken to exactly twice. I needed money, but more importantly, I needed infrastructure. I secured 2 jobs within 72 hours of arriving in Riverton. They were exhausting, menial, and paid barely above the minimum wage, but they were strategically perfect. At 4 a.m, long before the sun rose over the city skyline, I tied a stained white apron around my waist at a commercial bakery. I hauled 50-pound sacks of flour, scrubbed industrial mixing bowls until my knuckles cracked and bled, and arranged endless rows of pastries in the display cases. The physical toll was massive, leaving me with permanent dark circles under my eyes and pale burn marks on my forearms from the heavy ovens, but the job provided my primary source of food. The manager, a gruff man who asked 0 questions about my background, allowed me to take home the day-old bread, the misshapen bagels, and the burnt muffins that could not be sold. For weeks, I lived almost entirely on dense carbohydrates and tap water. At 3 p.m, I would strip off the flour-dusted apron, walk 2 miles across the city, and begin my second shift at a sprawling print and copy shop. I spent hours binding legal documents, clearing paper jams, and nodding politely at impatient customers. It was mind-numbing labor, but the copy shop was my true sanctuary. The manager was a tired woman who eagerly handed me the keys so she could leave early. When I locked the heavy glass doors at 9 p.m. and flipped the open sign to closed, the shop transformed into my personal studio. In the dead of night, bathed in the humming fluorescent lights of the empty store, I plugged my encrypted flash drive into the high-end drafting computers. I had lost the original paper copies in the fire, but my digital blueprints survived. With almost obsessive surgical discipline, I began to rebuild my life piece by piece. I used the shop's premium design software to recreate my architectural portfolio. I retraced every charcoal line I remembered from my designs of the Cedar Hollow public square. I rebuilt the structural models, agonizing over every dimension and angle, refusing to leave the computer until the lines were perfect. I retyped my personal essays from memory, staring at the glowing monitor until my vision blurred. There were nights when the sheer weight of exhaustion almost broke me. I would sit on the cold linoleum floor behind the counter, my head resting against the metal casing of a commercial printer, and the insidious voice my parents had planted in my mind would echo in the empty room. The voice whispered that I was foolish. It suggested that maybe I was never meant for anything more than bare survival. It told me that escaping my family's gravity was impossible, and that I would eventually crawl back to Cedar Hollow, begging for a place at the dinner table. The urge to give in to that voice, to surrender to the overwhelming fatigue, was suffocating, but every small task I completed became a weapon against that lie. Every fresh, heavyweight sheet of cardstock that slid out of the printer bearing my designs was an act of absolute rebellion. I was not just recreating my applications, I was proving to myself that I existed independently of my family's demands. I knew the digital files were not enough. I needed official documents to complete the deferred scholarship requirements for Briar Glen. I walked to the local post office and spent $15 to open a private box under my own name. It was a tiny metal square in a wall of hundreds, but holding that small brass key in my palm felt like holding a deed to a mansion. It was the first piece of the world I truly owned and controlled. A week later, a thick manila envelope arrived in the box. Inside, carefully organized and sealed with official school stamps, were replacement copies of my academic transcripts and the vital recommendation letters. Tucked between the folders was a single, handwritten note on a yellow sticky pad from my guidance counselor. Mrs. Leona Barrett. The note contained only 3 words telling me to keep building. I stood in the dusty lobby of the post office, clutching the heavy envelope against my chest, and felt a hot, silent tear roll down my cheek. Her quiet act of defiance proved that not every adult in my life was willing to abandon me. It anchored me to the reality that my worth was not tied to my parents' perception of me. Riverton taught me the brutal, unforgiving mathematics of independence. I learned to budget my life down to the exact dollar. I mapped out my expenses on the back of receipt paper, allocating exactly $12.50 a week for laundry and cheap vegetables to supplement the bakery bread. I learned to navigate the city with my head down, to trust very few people, and to keep my history locked away. But the deepest internal shift had nothing to do with money or logistics. Walking the lonely, freezing streets of Riverton, I finally learned how to stop equating love with sacrifice. In the Winslow house, affection was transactional. To be loved meant offering yourself up to be consumed, shrinking your own life so Grant could have more room to fail. Here, in the harsh, solitary reality of the city, I realized that true care did not require my destruction. I was allowed to protect myself. I was allowed to want a future that did not involve setting myself on fire to keep them warm. As winter began to fade into a wet, gray spring, I saw a flyer pinned to the community board near the copy shop registers. It advertised a local student design competition focused on transforming abandoned urban spaces. The old version of me, the girl from Cedar Hollow, would have walked past it, assuming I was not qualified or that my entry would be a waste of resources. The new version of me took the flyer down. Almost as a dare to myself, I spent 4 entirely sleepless nights drafting a comprehensive, highly detailed proposal to repurpose a defunct textile mill on the edge of Riverton into a sustainable community center. I paid the entry fee using a jar of loose change I had hoarded from the bakery tip jar. I did not expect to win. I simply wanted to prove that my creative voice had not burned in the fire pit. When the results were posted 2 weeks later, I did not take first place. I placed high enough in the honorable mentions to have my design displayed in the downtown Civic Center lobby. A few days after the exhibition, an unfamiliar email landed in my secret inbox. It was from a woman named Hannah Vale, a senior director at a small, respected urban planning firm called Northline Civic Design. She wrote that she had seen my proposal, appreciated the practical, grounded nature of my structural ideas, and wanted to offer me an interview for a paid entry-level internship. I sat at the copy shop computer, staring at the screen for a long time. I was still wearing boots with cardboard lining the soles to cover the holes. I was still living out of a canvas bag, calculating the exact cost of a bus fare, and shivering in drafty apartments. My life was still a jagged, difficult struggle for daily survival. But as I drafted my professional reply to Hannah Vale, I felt a fundamental emotional reversal settling deep into my bones. The terrified daughter they had tried to trap was gone. In her place was a young woman teaching herself, hour by agonizing hour, exactly how not to need them anymore. The transition from the grueling physical labor of the bakery to the quiet, climate-controlled studio of Northline Civic Design felt like stepping out of a raging storm into a vacuum. My entry-level internship was supposed to be administrative, fetching coffee and organizing reference files for the senior architects, but my hands could not stay idle. Whenever I finished my assigned tasks, I gravitated toward the drafting tables. I spent my lunch breaks redlining discarded blueprints and recalculating load-bearing distributions on scrap paper. My precision and endless patience quickly made me stand out. I was used to operating with zero margin for error. I treated every minor structural detail as if my life depended on it, because for 18 years, it had. My supervisor, Hannah Vale, a brilliant and notoriously sharp-tongued urban planner, took notice. She began pulling me into active project meetings, letting me sit in the corner and take notes. One Tuesday afternoon, Hannah called me into her glass-walled office. She slid a revised rendering I had done of a local transit shelter across her desk. She did not offer empty praise. Instead, she leaned back in her chair and studied me with a piercing gaze. She told me I had an exceptional eye for structural integrity, but that I worked like a cornered animal. She said I drafted lines as if I expected someone to snatch the pen out of my hand at any given second. She was entirely correct. I was perpetually braced for the floor to drop out from under me. Hannah folded her hands and delivered a challenge that shifted the entire trajectory of my year. She told me to stop operating on bare survival mode. She explained that if I could stabilize my personal finances enough to drop my other part-time jobs, and if I could submit one final, flawless portfolio revision before the first day of spring, she would personally sponsor my entry into a highly competitive deferred architecture pathway partnered with the firm. It was a tangible, guaranteed bridge to the exact future I was fighting for. The upward momentum was intoxicating. I finally had a secure foothold. But just as I began to trust the solid ground beneath my feet, my phone vibrated with a ghost from my past. It started as a trickle after months of absolute, deafening silence. The messages from Cedar Hollow did not contain apologies. They did not ask if I was safe, or warm, or fed. They were probing, manipulative check-ins dressed up in the suffocating language of familial concern. My father sent a brief, poorly spelled email stating he had some old financial paperwork connected to a childhood custodial account that required my immediate signature to close out. He framed it as an annoying bureaucratic hurdle, asking me to just sign on the dotted line so he could clear his desk. 2 days later, my mother left a voicemail. Her voice was bright, airy, and injected with a terrifying, artificial warmth. She casually asked if I could come home for just one weekend. She claimed she was reorganizing the attic and needed my help sorting through old family records, adding that Grant was incredibly busy and she really needed her dependable daughter. It sounded so aggressively normal that it made my stomach physically turn. They were speaking to me as if the backyard fire pit had simply been a minor disagreement over a burnt dinner. I did not reply to either of them. Instead, I did what I had learned to do best. I gathered information. During a quick phone call with a younger cousin who still lived in the county, and a careful scan of local social media pages, the truth about the sudden influx of affection became glaringly obvious. Grant's highly praised business expansion was violently collapsing. The new heavy machinery he had supposedly leased was actually borrowed from a rival contractor and had been repossessed. Redstone Restoration Group was drowning in unpaid invoices and angry suppliers. My brother had made another desperate, reckless attempt to make the company look like an empire, and he had cratered the family finances in the process. My parents were not reaching out because they missed me. They were reaching out because they were bleeding cash and needed a tourniquet. As I pieced together the timeline of Grant's financial ruin, a much darker, far more painful realization struck me. I scrolled through months of my cousin's casual family updates and noticed a gaping hole in the narrative. There were pictures of holiday dinners, complaints about local traffic, and vague allusions to my brother's stress. But there was absolutely no mention of my grandmother. I searched my memory frantically. The last time I had spoken to Evelyn was the night I asked her for advice about hiding my application documents. Since then, total silence. No one in my family had mentioned her name in a single email or voicemail. I asked my cousin offhandedly if she had seen Evelyn recently. My cousin hesitated. her voice dropping to an uncomfortable whisper, and admitted that Evelyn had been quite ill for several months. She assumed my parents had told me. They had not. They had managed the information about my grandmother's declining health with the exact same ruthless precision they used to manage my guilt. They kept me completely isolated from the only family member who had ever encouraged me to build my own house. The strategic silence was a weapon, designed to keep me disconnected from any source of strength or independent wealth. If I did not know Evelyn was sick, I could not reach out to her. I could not ask her about the custodial account my father was suddenly so desperate for me to sign away. The puzzle pieces locked together with sickening clarity. The custodial paperwork my father needed me to sign was undoubtedly tied to whatever funds he was frantically trying to access to save Grant from his own incompetence. My mother's sweet request for me to come home for one weekend was a trap. Once they had me back in that house, surrounded by their manufactured panic and practiced guilt trips, they would not let me leave until they extracted whatever asset they required. Sitting at my drafting table at Northline, bathed in the soft, cool light of the studio, I looked down at the blueprints I was revising. I looked at the solid, unbroken lines. I drafted a single, 2-sentence email to my father. I stated that I would not sign any financial documents without having them independently reviewed by my own legal counsel, and I requested that he stop contacting me. I deleted my mother's voicemail without returning the call. My hands did not shake when I hit send. There was no panic left in me, only a cold, profound understanding of my exact value to the Winslow family. They still did not see me as a human being, let alone a daughter. I was simply an unfinished asset. I was a structural beam they had temporarily lost track of. And now that their roof was caving in, they were desperately trying to drag me back to hold up the ceiling. I turned my phone on silent, slipped it into my desk drawer, and picked up my pen. I had a portfolio revision to finish before the first day of spring. I was no longer afraid of what they could take from me, because I finally understood that I held the power to simply refuse to give it. The calendar on the wall of the Northline Civic Design Studio marked exactly 6 months since the night the sky over my backyard turned orange. It was a Tuesday morning, overcast and quiet, the kind of day where the world felt wrapped in a thick layer of damp wool. I was standing at the industrial printer, waiting for a set of zoning maps to finish spooling, when my cell phone vibrated against my hip. It was an unknown number with a Riverton area code. I assumed it was a city clerk returning a call about a building permit. I wiped my ink-stained hands on a paper towel, stepped into the empty hallway outside the studio, and answered. Amelia Winslow. The voice on the other end was a woman's. It was crisp, professional, and entirely unfamiliar. It carried the polished, unhurried cadence of someone who was very used to being listened to. Speaking, I replied, leaning my shoulder against the cool glass of the corridor window. My name is Miriam Cole. I am an attorney with Cole & Associates here in downtown Riverton. Are you currently in a place where you can speak privately? The question sent a sharp, involuntary spike of adrenaline through my nervous system. My mind immediately flashed to the vague, threatening legal jargon my father occasionally used when trying to intimidate subcontractors. I wondered for a panicked second if my parents had somehow found a way to sue me, to force me back to Cedar Hollow through some twisted custodial loophole. I pushed through the heavy door of an empty conference room, ensuring the latch clicked shut behind me. I am alone, I said, my voice steady despite the sudden hammering in my chest. What is this about, Ms. Cole? There was a brief, highly calibrated pause on the line. It was the sound of a lawyer measuring the exact weight of the words she was about to drop. I am calling in my capacity as the executor of the estate for Evelyn Winslow, Miriam Cole said softly. Amelia, I am very sorry to be the one to inform you of this, especially over the phone. Your grandmother passed away 7 weeks earlier. The breath left my lungs in a single, silent rush. The walls of the conference room seemed to violently contract, pressing the air out of the space. 7 weeks. The words made absolutely no sense. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass of the window, staring blankly at the gray traffic moving on the street below. 7 weeks ago, I was buying discounted groceries. 7 weeks ago, I was drafting structural supports. While I was meticulously building my new life, the only person who had ever encouraged me to do so was already gone. The grief did not come as a wave of tears. It hit with a delayed, icy force. It was a profound, suffocating ache that settled directly behind my ribs. I had not been told. I had not been invited to a service. I had not been allowed the basic human dignity of saying goodbye. My family had buried my grandmother, lowered her into the earth, and then gone back to their kitchen table to eat dinner as if nothing had happened. My first reaction was pure, paralyzing heartbreak. I remembered Evelyn's voice on that crackling payphone, telling me to build my house anyway. I squeezed my eyes shut, a solitary, hot tear escaping and tracing a burning path down my cheek. But the heartbreak was almost immediately swallowed by something much sharper: suspicion. It rose in my throat like bile. My mother and father did not operate on oversight or forgetfulness. In the Winslow household, information was the most valuable currency, and they hoarded it with ruthless efficiency. If Evelyn had died, Russell and Diane would only stay completely silent if they believed that silence directly benefited them. They kept me in the dark, because they did not want me asking questions. How, I managed to whisper, my throat tight and dry. Why am I only hearing about this now? Why did nobody call me? The timeline of notification was entirely dictated by the legal constraints of the estate, not by your parents, Miriam clarified, her tone remaining steadfastly professional, but carrying a subtle edge of sympathy. I was instructed to wait until the probate filings cleared their initial hurdles before establishing contact. Evelyn updated her estate plan several times in the last 2 years. She structured it with a very specific, ironclad set of instructions, and she explicitly named you as a primary interested party. I pulled my forehead away from the glass, my brow furrowing in deep confusion. A primary interested party, Ms. Cole. My grandmother and my parents have been estranged for years. She stopped funding my brother's businesses. My parents hated her for it. They always told me she cut the whole family off. Your parents' understanding of the situation is fundamentally incomplete, Miriam replied smoothly. Evelyn's estate is complex. As a primary interested party, you are legally required to be present for the formal reading and the execution of the trust instruments. The meeting is scheduled for this coming Friday at 10 o'clock in the morning at my office. A cold dread began to pool in my stomach. Who else is going to be there? The summons includes Russell Winslow, Diane Winslow, and Grant Winslow, she answered. My grip on the phone tightened until my knuckles turned white. If my parents and Grant were summoned, it meant whatever Evelyn left behind was significant enough that they fully expected to claim a massive part of it. It meant my father thought this was his ultimate bailout, the final rescue package for Grant's collapsing empire. I cannot do it, I said instantly, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. Ms. Cole, I'm sorry about my grandmother. I truly am. But I cannot sit in a room with those people. You do not understand what they did. They burned my life to the ground. Literally. I have spent the last 6 months fighting tooth and nail just to survive without them. I will not go back into a room and let them look at me. Whatever she left them, they can have it. Just mail me whatever paperwork I need to sign to forfeit my presence. I cannot do that, Amelia, Miriam said, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave, shifting from a formal attorney to someone delivering a vital warning. I strongly advise you against making any decisions regarding forfeiture. Evelyn did not merely leave money. She left heavily protected trust instruments. She left extensive supporting records. She left very specific, legally binding written instructions that require your physical signature in the room. And most importantly, she left a private letter intended specifically and solely for you. I paced the length of the conference room, my boots making soft, frantic thuds against the carpet. The prospect of facing my mother's terrifying calm, my father's booming entitlement, and my brother's arrogant smirk made my skin crawl. The smell of burning paper drifted through my memory like a phantom, choking me. I wanted to hang up. I wanted to go back to my drafting table, draw clean lines, and pretend Cedar Hollow no longer existed. They will tear me apart, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, stripping away the armor I had built over the last half year. If they think I am standing between them and a payout, they will destroy me all over again. I am finally safe here. Miriam Cole did not offer hollow reassurances. She did not tell me that family was family or that things would be okay. Instead, she said one sentence that struck the center of my chest with the force of a physical blow. Your grandmother anticipated resistance. I stopped pacing. I stood dead center in the room, staring at the blank whiteboard on the wall. What does that mean? I asked. It means Evelyn was a highly observant woman, Miriam said, the legal precision in her voice cutting through my panic like a scalpel. She spent the last 2 years of her life working very closely with my firm to ensure that her exact wishes could not be overridden, contested, or bullied out of existence. She knew exactly who your parents were. She knew exactly how they operated. She anticipated their resistance, and she anticipated your fear. The structure she built requires you to be there because she designed it to protect you. For the first time since the night of the fire, the narrative cracked wide open. I had always thought of Evelyn as a distant, quiet ally who offered good advice from afar, but ultimately stayed out of the blast radius. I thought I was fighting my family entirely alone, but Miriam's words painted a radically different picture. Evelyn had not been looking away. She had been watching. She had seen the quiet theft, the subtle dismissals, and the constant sacrifices demanded of me. She had seen far more than she ever said out loud. The phone call was not a summons to a new battle. It was the moment a very old, very quiet war finally surfaced in the daylight. Evelyn had spent years setting the board, moving pieces into place while my parents were completely oblivious, drunk on their own arrogance. She had died, but she had left a trap waiting to be sprung. And she needed me to pull the lever. The fear that had been paralyzing me slowly began to evaporate, replaced by a cold, clinical focus. I was no longer the terrified girl holding a ruined scholarship binder. I was an architect. I knew how to read blueprints, and I was suddenly very eager to see the structure my grandmother had built. 10 o'clock on Friday, I said, my voice finally steady, echoing with a new, hardened resolve. Send me the address, Ms. Cole. I will be there. Cole & Associates occupied the 14th floor of a sleek, steel and glass building in the absolute center of downtown Riverton. I stepped off the elevator at exactly 10 o'clock on Friday morning. I was wearing a tailored black blazer I had purchased from a consignment shop for $12. My posture perfectly straight, my hands steady. I did not look like a terrified runaway. I looked like an architect preparing to inspect a condemned building. The heavy oak door of the primary conference room was already open. The air inside was suffocatingly tense. My family sat huddled on one side of a long mahogany table. The second I walked through the door, my father crossed his arms, his face instantly twisting into a mask of insulted fury. Unbelievable, Russell muttered, his voice booming in the quiet room. He glared at me as if my very presence was a personal attack. She actually showed up. You abandon your family, ignore us for half a year, and then come running the second you smell money. You have absolutely no shame. Amelia. Russell, please, do not raise your voice, my mother whispered loudly. Diane pressed a perfectly white tissue to her completely dry eyes, performing her wounded motherhood with practiced elegance. She looked at me, her expression dripping with a cloying, artificial sorrow. Amelia, we have been sick with worry. To walk away from us like that, and to only show your face when an inheritance is involved, it simply breaks my heart. We thought we raised you to have better values. At the far end of the table, Grant did not even bother to look up from his phone. He slouched in a high-backed leather chair, his legs stretched out casually. Let us just get the check cut, Grant said, his tone heavy with arrogant boredom. I have equipment vendors waiting on me. Let us divide this up so I can get back to running the business. He genuinely assumed he was the most important person in the room, waiting to collect the real prize. I did not sit with them. I took a seat on the exact opposite side of the mahogany table. directly facing the three of them. I did not say a word. I simply watched them. A moment later, Miriam Cole entered the room. She was a striking woman with silver hair pulled into a tight knot, carrying a thick stack of manila folders. She sat at the head of the table, adjusted her glasses, and folded her hands over the documents. "Good morning," Miriam said, her voice commanding immediate and absolute attention. "We are here for the reading and execution of the estate of Evelyn Winslow. I will begin with a basic summary of the holdings." Miriam opened the first folder. The atmosphere in the room subtly shifted as she began to read. Evelyn had not lived a lavish life, so my parents clearly expected a modest savings account and perhaps a life insurance policy. Instead, Miriam listed a staggering array of assets. There were high-yield investment accounts, a commercial property deed, a private mortgage note, and several heavily protected trust instruments. The sheer volume of the estate hung in the air, thick and heavy. My father leaned forward, placing his large, calloused hands flat on the table. The anger in his eyes was instantly replaced by a ravenous, calculating hunger. "Well," Russell said, puffing out his chest and attempting to sound authoritative, "that is certainly more extensive than we anticipated. As Evelyn's only living son, I am prepared to take over the administration of these accounts immediately. Grant and I have a massive expansion plan for the company, and these assets will flow perfectly into our operational capital." Miriam looked up from her files. She did not blink. "Mr. Winslow, you are not the administrator of this estate." Miriam corrected him, her voice as smooth and cold as a sheet of ice. In fact, Evelyn structured the entirety of her estate to bypass exactly that outcome. "You are not a beneficiary. You have been left nothing." A dead, heavy silence slammed into the room. My father's face turned a violent shade of purple. He opened his mouth to speak, but the shock robbed him of his breath. Diane lowered her tissue, the fake sorrow vanishing, replaced by genuine, unadulterated panic. "Moving on," Miriam continued smoothly, turning her attention directly to me. "Amelia, your grandmother left you a substantial liquid inheritance. It is currently held in a fully funded, protected trust that you, and only you, control upon your 18th birthday. The funds are cleared and available immediately." Grant dropped his phone onto the table with a loud clatter. "Wait a minute. You are giving the cash to the teenager. That is completely absurd. What about the family assets? What about the real estate?" "I am getting to the real estate," Miriam said, pulling a heavy notarized deed from the second folder. "The first major physical asset is a commercial warehouse located on Miller Street in Cedar Hollow. Evelyn owned the building outright." I watched the color drain entirely from my father's face. "She owned it," Russell choked out, his voice cracking. "We have a lease. Redstone Restoration Group has operated out of that building for 10 years. We have a very generous private arrangement." "You had a lease with Evelyn," Miriam clarified, her legal precision slicing through his delusion. "That lease was a month-to-month courtesy. With her passing, the property now belongs exclusively to Amelia's trust. Amelia is now your landlord." The first shock hit the table like a hammer, but the second shock landed with the devastating force of a wrecking ball. Miriam opened the third folder. "The second physical asset is a private mortgage note. 5 years ago, Evelyn quietly paid off the bank mortgage on the Winslow family residence. She refinanced the home privately to keep the property from falling into foreclosure." "Foreclosure?" I asked, my voice cutting through the silence for the first time. Miriam nodded toward my parents. "Yes. The foreclosure was triggered by a massive default tied to a commercial equipment lease signed by your brother. Grant, Evelyn saved the home, but she kept the note. She owned the debt on the house you all currently live in. And as of this morning, that note has been fully transferred to Amelia." Grant started unraveling right in front of me. His arrogant posture collapsed. He stared wildly at my father. "Wait, the house is not paid off. You told me we owned it free and clear. You told me we could leverage the equity for my new business loan." "Shut up, Grant," Russell hissed, his hands trembling on the table. "No." Grant practically shouted, his voice pitching upward in panic. He realized that the mighty family assets he had taken for granted, the wealth he assumed was his birthright, were entirely a mirage. You said the business owned the building. You said we had a safety net. You own absolutely nothing. We are just tenants. You were tenants under Evelyn's mercy, Miriam stated coldly. And now, you are tenants under Amelia's. Diane stared at me, her mouth slightly open, breathing in shallow, terrified gasps. The impenetrable wall of her domestic coldness was completely shattered. Miriam picked up a sealed ivory envelope from the center of her files. Before we discuss the administration of these assets, Evelyn left written instructions. She included a private letter intended to be read aloud, specifically for Amelia, in the presence of this room. Miriam broke the wax seal, unfolded the heavy paper, and began to read my grandmother's final words. "My dearest Amelia," Miriam read, her voice carrying Evelyn's unwavering strength. "For 18 years, I watched you build a foundation out of nothing. While your parents worshipped a house of cards, I knew what was happening. I saw you being diminished. I saw your brilliance delayed. And I saw your future constantly sacrificed to sustain the endless, reckless failures of a boy who refuses to become a man. They expected you to absorb their losses. They expected you to disappear into the foundation so they could stand tall. I refused to let that happen. I did not leave you this estate so you could simply survive them. I left it to you so you can finally be the one who decides who gets to stand under your roof." Miriam lowered the letter and placed it gently in front of me. The emotional temperature of the room completely inverted. The terrifying gravity my parents had always held over me simply ceased to exist. I looked at my father, who was staring at the mahogany table, entirely broken. I looked at my mother, who was trembling, stripped of her calm superiority. I looked at Grant, who was pale and hyperventilating, finally forced to face the reality of his own utter uselessness. I was no longer the inconvenient, dramatic daughter who had run away in the middle of the night. As I sat in the high-backed leather chair, resting my hands on the documents that dictated their entire existence, I realized the absolute truth. I was the person sitting at the exact center of the structure that had kept the whole family standing, and now I held the power to tear it all down. My father's shock lasted exactly 60 seconds before his survival instincts kicked in. The desperation morphed into a calculated, aggressive bluff. He pushed his chair back, the heavy wood scraping loudly against the floor. "This is entirely fraudulent," Russell declared, jabbing a thick finger toward the stack of folders. "My mother was 82 years old and completely isolated in her final months. She was clearly manipulated. I am not going to sit here and let some predatory law firm and a vindictive teenager steal the family business. We will contest this. I will drag this estate through probate court for the next 10 years if I have to." Miriam Cole did not even blink. She did not raise her voice or offer a heated rebuttal. She simply slid her hand over the next manila folder, opening it with the casual grace of a card dealer turning over a winning hand. "Mr. Winslow, I highly recommend you sit down and listen very carefully," Miriam said. "Evelyn was acutely aware of your tendency toward litigation. Therefore, 72 hours before finalizing this iteration of her estate, she requested and completed a comprehensive cognitive evaluation by 3 independent, board-certified neurologists. I have their sworn affidavits right here." She tapped a thick stack of medical records. She was deemed perfectly lucid, possessing total executive function and absolute clarity of intent. Furthermore, the trust includes a punitive no-contest clause. If you attempt to challenge her competence, you will be immediately liable for all legal fees incurred by the estate, which will be forcefully extracted from the commercial equipment you currently claim to own. Russell's mouth snapped shut. He slowly lowered himself back into his chair, the bluster draining out of him, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell. "Now," Miriam continued, the temperature in the room dropping another 10 degrees, "we must address the matter of the custodial education account." I sat up straighter, This was the ghost account my father had desperately tried to get me to sign away through that email a few weeks prior. Miriam extracted a bound ledger, sliding it directly into the center of the table. 15 years ago, Evelyn established a protected college fund for Amelia. Because Amelia was a minor, Russell and Diane were listed as the custodial managers. The explicit legal mandate of those funds was educational advancement. However, the financial forensics we conducted over the last 2 months tell a very different story. Miriam began reading dates and withdrawals, translating my family's history into cold, undeniable mathematics. 4 years ago, $22,000 withdrawn and transferred to Redstone Restoration Group to cover defaulted commercial vehicle leases. 3 years ago, $35,000 withdrawn to satisfy an out-of-court private settlement regarding heavy machinery damage caused by Grant Winslow. 2 years ago, $18,000 withdrawn to cover payroll taxes that Russell had neglected to file. The numbers hit me with physical force. I had known they used the money. My father had admitted as much in the backyard. But hearing the exact ledger of their theft was profoundly different. They had not just repurposed a few dollars in a moment of panic. They had systematically, quietly bled my future dry over the course of 4 years. Every time I had stayed up past midnight studying for an exam, every time I had carefully saved quarters for a sketch pad, they had been visiting the bank to write another check for Grant's incompetence. The fire in the backyard had never been the true murder of my dreams. It was just the cremation of the evidence. The real theft had happened entirely in the dark, while I was sitting across from them at the dinner table, trusting them. "You forged my signature on the closing documents," I stated. My voice was completely flat, devoid of any emotion. It was not a question. "That is why you emailed me last month. You needed my actual signature to finalize the closure before the estate audit caught you." My father refused to look at me. He stared rigidly at the grain of the mahogany table. Miriam did not let them breathe. She opened a thin blue folder. Evelyn's awareness of this embezzlement was triggered by an external source. "I have printed copies of a 6-month email correspondence between Evelyn and your high school guidance counselor, Leona Barrett." My heart skipped a beat. Mrs. Barrett. Mrs. Barrett contacted Evelyn late last autumn. Miriam read from the top page. She expressed deep concern because Diane Winslow had personally called the high school administration to cancel Amelia's transcript requests. Diane explicitly lied to the school, stating that Amelia had suffered a mental breakdown and had decided to stay home to work. I turned my head slowly to look at my mother, the woman who had never raised her voice to me, the woman who had calmly fed my portfolio into the flames. She had actively, methodically tried to sever my lifelines behind my back. Diane finally cracked. The elegant posture dissolved, and she gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. "Everything we did to protect this family," she cried out, her voice shrill and desperate. "You do not understand the pressure, Amelia. We were drowning. Grant's business was the only chance we had to build something permanent for the Winslow name. You were always so smart, so capable. You did not need a massive college fund to survive. You could always figure things out. Grant needed the help. We had to make sacrifices to keep the roof over our heads." Her defense was the most devastating truth of all. In her mind, the calculation was perfectly justified. Grant was allowed to fail endlessly because he was the chosen heir, the symbol of the family's pride. I was simply the shock absorber. I was the family member designated to bleed so that Grant did not have to feel the sting of his own mistakes. At the mention of his name, Grant suddenly erupted. He slammed his fists down on the table, knocking over a glass of water that spilled across the polished wood. "Do not put this on me," Grant yelled, his face contorted in ugly adolescent rage. He pointed an accusing finger at our parents. "You made me look like a total parasite. You told me the business was generating massive profits. You told me the house was paid for by the company. You stole her money and lied to me about where it came from to make yourselves look like big-shot investors. You set me up to fail." It was a spectacular, pathetic display. even faced with the undeniable proof that his entire adult life was subsidized by my stolen future and his grandmother's secret charity, Grant still refused to carry an ounce of responsibility. He was not angry that I had been robbed. He was furious that his parents had made him look foolish. His eruption entirely backfired, stripping away any lingering illusion that he was a victim. He was just a hollow, entitled shell of a man. Miriam let the shouting echo off the glass walls for a long moment before she calmly gathered her folders, tapping the edges against the table to align them perfectly. The forensic audit of the custodial theft has been formally submitted to the estate records, Miriam stated, cutting through Grant's tantrum like a blade. Which brings us to the final, most crucial point of this meeting. She slid a single, legally bound document across the table, stopping it exactly an inch from my fingertips. Because Evelyn transferred the deed of the commercial property and the mortgage note of the family residence directly into a trust that you exclusively control, Miriam explained, her eyes locking onto mine. I no longer represent Evelyn Winslow. I represent the trust, which means, Amelia, I represent you. The room fell into an absolute, breathless silence. The power dynamic, which had been rigidly enforced for 18 years, officially shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The choices regarding the commercial lease for Redstone Restoration Group, Miriam said clearly, the choices regarding the outstanding debt on the family home, and the decisions regarding the legal pursuit of the stolen $85,000 from the custodial account do not belong to the estate. They belong to the note holder. I looked down at the document. My name was printed at the top in bold, black ink. The final choice about enforcement, about mercy, and about how much distance you wish to place between yourself and these individuals, Miriam concluded softly, belongs to you, Amelia, and you alone. I sat perfectly still, listening to the shallow, terrified breathing of the three people across from me. They were entirely at my mercy, and for the first time in my life, my hands were not shaking at all. I did not make my final decisions sitting in that mahogany conference room. The sheer magnitude of the power suddenly resting in my hands required a level of emotional structural analysis that could not be rushed. I asked Miriam Cole to pause the proceedings, packed my blazer, and walked out of the building, leaving my family sitting in stunned silence. For the next 3 nights, I barely slept. I sat on the floor of my cramped Riverton apartment, staring at the headlights sweeping across the ceiling, considering the true anatomy of revenge. When the people who systematically dismantled your future are also the people who taught you how to walk, vengeance is a complicated architecture. The easiest, most seductive fantasy was pure chaos. A loud, primal part of me wanted to corner them in a parking lot, to scream until my vocal cords bled, to mirror the exact, humiliating cruelty they had shown me in the backyard. But yielding to that impulse would have flattened me into exactly what Grant was, a creature driven entirely by unchecked emotional reactions. I refused to let their dysfunction dictate my character. If I was going to dismantle their hold on me, I would do it not with fire, but with cold, elegant, and entirely lawful precision. On Monday morning, I returned to Cole and Associates. I sat across from Miriam, sipping black coffee, and began laying out the consequences. They would be highly specific, heavily documented, and absolutely impossible for my family to wriggle out of. We started with Redstone Restoration Group. I instructed Miriam to formally terminate the Sweetheart lease on the commercial building on Miller Street. I did not evict my father overnight. That would have been malicious and unprofessional. Instead, I issued a standard 30-day notice to vacate, accompanied by a legally proper option to renegotiate a new lease at the full the current market rate. If my father's business was the booming empire he constantly claimed it was, he would have no trouble paying what the square footage was actually worth. If it was a failing facade, the open market would simply correct his delusion. Next, we addressed the stolen education funds. Miriam asked if I wished to pursue criminal fraud charges for the embezzlement. I declined, not out of any lingering sense of forgiveness, but because a messy, protracted trial would keep me chained to their drama for years. Instead, I directed that the $85,000 debt be formally accounted for and aggressively levied against any minor, secondary bequests my parents might have expected to scrape from the outer edges of the estate. The debt became an immovable legal lien. I did not forgive a single cent. I simply transformed their quiet theft into a glaring public financial liability. Finally, there was the matter of the Winslow family home. For years, my parents had slept soundly under a roof they believed was permanently secured by Evelyn's silent charity. They had assumed her bailout was a fixed state of reality, a permanent shield against their own bad decisions. I authorized Miriam to call the private mortgage note due. I gave them a standard 90-day window to secure independent refinancing from a commercial bank. If they could not qualify for a loan on their own merit, a highly likely scenario given Grant's catastrophic impact on their credit history, the house would be put on the open market and sold. The revenge felt profoundly satisfying because it lacked any trace of sadism. I was not destroying them the way they had tried to destroy me. I was simply removing the artificial support system that had allowed them to comfortably feed on my future. I was introducing them, for the very first time in their lives, to the concept of gravity. As we finalized the paperwork, Miriam closed her heavy folders and offered a rare, genuine smile. She told me there was one final matter, a secondary provision Evelyn had arranged entirely outside the primary estate. Knowing the volatile and suffocating nature of my household, my grandmother had deeply feared that my parents would find a way to sabotage my first attempt to escape. She had not just paid attention to my struggles, she had actively ensured my ambitions. Miriam handed me a verified, sealed letter from the admissions office of the Briar Glen School of Architecture. Evelyn had quietly established a deferred, fully funded scholarship reserve directly with the university, locked away in an educational trust that my parents could never touch. My place in the architecture program was not lost. It had been waiting for me all along. The weight of Evelyn's profound foresight brought a sharp, stinging heat to my eyes, but I did not have long to process it. As I stepped out of the law firm's heavy glass doors and onto the downtown sidewalk, I found my mother waiting for me. Diane stepped out from the shadow of a concrete planter. She looked entirely diminished, her usual immaculate presentation frayed at the edges. She rushed forward, grabbing my forearm with trembling, desperate hands. I stopped, looking down at her fingers gripping my sleeve, and she quickly pulled her hand back as if she had touched a hot stove. "Amelia, please," Diane begged, her voice a breathless, frantic whisper. "You have to go back inside and talk to Miriam. You have to stop this. Your father is beside himself. Grant is completely falling apart. You cannot do this to us. You cannot punish the whole family over one bad night." I stood on the bustling Riverton sidewalk, surrounded by the noise of city traffic and passing pedestrians. I looked at the woman who had watched my portfolio turn to ash without shedding a single tear. The woman who had actively lied to my high school to keep me trapped. I searched my chest for the old, familiar ache, the desperate need for her approval, the ingrained habit of shrinking to accommodate her coldness. It was entirely gone. It had evaporated into the cool afternoon air. I did not raise my voice, I did not sneer, and I did not gloat. I looked directly into her eyes and delivered the sentence that finally and permanently reframed the entire history of our family. "It was never one night, Mom," I said softly, the absolute moral clarity of the statement ringing between us like a struck bell. "The fire was just the first thing you did where I could smell it." Diane flinched violently, as if the words possessed a physical weight. She opened her mouth to argue, to deploy another familiar layer of maternal manipulation, but the absolute certainty in my posture completely silenced her. She realized, in that terrible moment, that there were no more levers left to pull. I turned my back on her and walked down the street, my steps even and measured, leaving her standing alone in the shadow of the building. The architecture of my new life was finally drafted, and it had absolutely no room for them. I drove back into Cedar Hollow on a Thursday afternoon. The sky was a pale, bruised purple, and the familiar streets of my hometown felt impossibly narrow. pulling into the cracked concrete driveway of the house I grew up in. I realized I did not feel the usual, suffocating knot of anxiety tightening in my throat. I parked my secondhand car, killed the engine, and looked at the sagging front porch. I was not returning as a frightened, obedient daughter begging for permission to exist. I was arriving as the legal decision-maker whose signature now controlled the very ground beneath their feet. I unlocked the front door and walked into the living room. They were all waiting for me. The air was thick with a toxic, heavy mixture of panic and boiling resentment. My father stood rigidly by the brick fireplace, puffing his chest out, desperately attempting to project an authority he no longer legally possessed. He immediately launched into a booming, aggressive lecture. He tried pure intimidation, raising his voice to rattle the windows, accusing me of profound disloyalty and threatening to entangle me in endless lawsuits. When his bluster fell completely flat against my absolute silence, my mother took over. Diane collapsed onto the floral sofa, burying her face in her hands. She began to sob with a theatrical intensity, performing a wounded desperation that completely lacked genuine tears. She pleaded with me to remember the value of family, spinning a web of guilt about how hard they had worked to keep a roof over my head. Then, Grant tried a new, incredibly pathetic tactic. The usual arrogant smirk was entirely gone, replaced by a frantic, whining pitch. He paced rapidly across the faded rug, wildly gesturing at our parents. He tried to rebrand himself as just another victim of the family's dysfunction. He claimed that their relentless pressure to build a legacy had broken him, and that he only took the money because they manipulated him into it. I stood in the center of the room and simply watched the three of them perform. A year ago, their shifting, chaotic tactics would have spun my head in agonizing circles. Now, I did not mistake their desperate performance for truth. I saw them for exactly what they were. They were not a family mourning a broken bond. They were simply tenants terrified of eviction. I held up my hand. The room fell into a sudden, jarring silence. I did not yell. I did not sneer. I spoke with the calm, immovable cadence of an architect laying out a finalized blueprint. I delivered the final terms. I informed them that the house would officially go on the open market in exactly 90 days unless they could secure independent financing from a commercial bank to buy out the mortgage note. I turned to my father and stated that Redstone Restoration Group had exactly 30 days to either vacate the commercial building entirely or sign a new, legally binding lease at the full, uncompromising market rate. Finally, I looked at all three of them and stated with absolute clarity that none of them would ever have access to me, my education, or the financial security my grandmother had secured for my future. There would be no negotiations. There would be no holiday visits. The transaction was over. I left them standing in the stunned, breathless silence of the living room and walked down the narrow hallway toward my old bedroom. The walls of the house felt incredibly close together. I saw, with painful, blinding clarity, how many years I had spent physically and emotionally shrinking myself just so everyone else could stay comfortable in their delusions. I had made myself small so Grant could feel big. I had stayed quiet so my parents would not have to face their own failures. That recognition washed over me, and it was far more powerful than any lingering anger. It was a profound, cleansing relief. Before I left the law firm in Riverton earlier that week, Miriam Cole had handed me one final, sealed ivory envelope. Evelyn had left strict instructions that it was only to be delivered after the legal meeting had concluded. I stood in the center of my empty childhood room and broke the wax seal. The handwritten note was short, but it carried the weight of a monumental blessing. Evelyn wrote that she did not leave me the money merely so I could survive my family. She left it so I would never again have to ask anyone for permission to become myself. Attached to the letter was a small brass key and a note directing me to the crawlspace panel at the back of my closet. Evelyn had known the structural secrets of this house far better than my parents did. I pushed the panel aside and reached into the dark hollow between the drywall. My fingers brushed against solid wood. I pulled out a heavy, perfectly sanded cedar box. Inside, resting on a bed of velvet, was a beautiful vintage brass drafting set. Beneath the heavy metal instruments lay meticulously folded copies of the childhood sketches I used to draw of our town. Evelyn had quietly saved them all those years, preserving the physical proof of my talent when my parents tried to erase it. Holding that cedar box against my chest, the last, hardened shard of my grief dissolved into a quiet, enduring strength. I walked out the back door and stepped onto the lawn. The autumn air was sharp and biting. My parents had followed me outside, their faces pale and drawn. They stood near the rusted iron fire pit, lingering in the exact spot where they had once burned my application binders to keep Grant warm. They looked entirely defeated, stripped of their power, their pride, and their unearned wealth. They had absolutely nothing left to say. As I walked across the grass toward my car, my cell phone vibrated in my coat pocket. I answered it. It was the admissions coordinator from the Briar Glen School of Architecture. Her voice was bright, professional, and entirely welcoming as she officially confirmed my place in the upcoming fall cohort. She informed me that my housing deposit and my first-year tuition had been fully processed and cleared through the scholarship trust my grandmother had built for me. The pathway was completely clear. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. I looked at the cold, gray ashes in the fire pit one last time, then turned and opened my car door. I slid into the driver's seat, put the car in gear, and pulled out of the driveway. I did not look back in the rearview mirror. I was driving away not as a victim fleeing the ruins of a broken home, but as a young woman finally carrying her life firmly in her own capable hands. Behind me, the family that had treated me like an expendable support beam was left to face a collapsing future that absolutely no one was coming to rescue them from. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments below, so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and support us by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.